устраивают пробку с Россией.
Those cars are filled with fighting-age men trying to leave Russia before they get drafted. Alec Luhn is tracking the developments. Alec, we've been seeing these incredible images of Russians trying to flee the country and the extremely long lines at the border. What have you been hearing and seeing?
Well, I've been seeing it firsthand in a lot of cases. A lot of my friends back in Russia are now trying to leave the country. I came to Istanbul myself after the invasion started. A lot of Russians did the same. But also, a lot of people stayed in Russia. Now, all of a sudden, people who are trying to keep their heads down, trying to just stick to their lives, are not able to do that because they're at risk of being mobilized or their relatives are at risk of being mobilized. So we've seen lines miles long at the borders out of Russia, tens of thousands of Russians trying to flee the country. A friend of mine right now is on the border with Kazakhstan. He has been for more than a day, was waiting all last night in the rain, waiting for his turn to try to cross into Kazakhstan. People are worried that the borders are going to be closed when Putin speaks later this week, and that at that point they won't be able to get out of the country and they'll just have to wait until they get drafted into the army and sent to Ukraine. So there's a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety around that, and really it's like nothing we've ever seen before in Russia. The Kremlin didn't want to announce a draft. It has not called this a war. It's insisted on calling it a special military operation. Now suddenly Russians everywhere are seeing the reality of it, that this is very much a war, and it's not going in Russia's favor right now.
And what else are you hearing from your sources inside the country about the political atmosphere? How is this playing for Putin?
It's tough to say. On the one hand, there have been protests. On the other hand, they've been limited. They've kind of fizzled out in Moscow and St. Petersburg. We actually saw some protests in the Caucasus regions in southern Russia. Those are the regions that have had the most soldiers killed in Ukraine because they're overrepresented in Russia's military. A lot of people there serve. And we've seen angry mothers confronting police, asking them why they're taking their sons, why don't their sons go and fight in the war. And there's been a lot of public anger over this that the Kremlin even had to respond to. It was so big. Kremlin saying that it doesn't understand the hysteria around these moves. And so really it's changed a bit in Russia. At the same time, I think that Russia has a very well-oiled police mechanism, a lot of riot police, a lot of experience putting down protests, raising the costs of protest, raising the cost of dissent with court cases, targeted arrests, putting people in prison. So, and now, added to that is the fact that if you get arrested at a protest, we've been seeing reports that you're being drafted into the military from the police station and sent to the war in Ukraine. So now it's an even higher cost to protest. And so I think that Putin is counting on that repressive mechanism to keep a lid on things, to keep this from getting out of hand. But at the same time, there's no denying that a lot of Russians who are not necessarily following the war, who are not opposed to the war, are suddenly feeling this war get very real for them in a very personal way. And it's an open question how they're going to deal with that in the long run.
You're talking about this potentially prolonging the conflict. What are you hearing about the question that keeps coming up around the nuclear option? Is that something that you think is more of a reality now, given this order?
It's definitely more of a reality, not so much because of the mobilization, but because of the context around it. This mobilization is happening as Russia holds these so-called referendums in the territory that is occupied in Ukraine. They're really rushing that referendum through. It seems pretty clear that Russia is going to annex those territories and declare them part of Russia. And that, of course, will change this conflict, at least from Moscow's perspective. What has been a very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive, Ukraine taking back territory from Russian forces in Ukraine, will now, at least in the Kremlin's telling, once they annex it, be an attack on Russia itself, an attack on Russian territory. And that's where the nuclear question comes into play. Putin said very clearly last week, he was talking about nuclear weapons, and he said that Russia would use all weapons at its disposal to protect its territory. Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, 5,000 some warheads, and it's prepared to use those to protect its territory. Well, now that territory, at least according to the Kremlin, is probably going to include those parts of Ukraine that Russian forces have occupied. So the stakes are definitely being raised. We know that that Washington has been talking directly with Moscow via the red phone line that's so famous from the Cold War era, telling Moscow that there will be catastrophic consequences if it uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. So those conversations are taking place. At the same time, it's very clear that the risk is growing of that kind of confrontation.
Alec Luhn in Istanbul, thanks for your reporting.
I'm Michael Learmonth, editor-in-chief of Vice News. Too often, traditional news outlets shy away from the real stories and experiences of those living through global conflicts. Not Vice News. Our reporters are on the ground, fearlessly covering the human stories that shape our world. You and millions of others can continue to read, watch, and listen to Vice News for free. But we hope you'll consider making a one-time or ongoing contribution of any size at vice.com/contribute. Every contribution, no matter how big or small, helps support the journalism Vice News brings to you every day. Thank you.